So I'll try to keep this short today. So the last place I was in Australia was also my longest stay of the year. I was with the Sisters of St. Joseph, an order of Catholic women religious, not technically nuns because they don't stay in a convent and aren't contemplatives. They were founded by Mary MacKillop, who's actually Australia's first saint. But well before she was canonized, she was actually excommunicated. Because so she co-founded the order to be dedicated to teaching the poorest children in Australia and giving really practical education. And not long after that, after starting schools, they also started refuge houses for single mothers, women working on the street, things like that. And the local bishop wrote to then not a saint, Mary MacKillop, that they needed to change to be doing something closer to finishing school for young ladies, that this sort of wasn't proper work. And she said, respectfully, Bishop, no, that's not what we're about. And that's not what sisters were supposed to say to bishops. So then she was excommunicated for a while. And then was allowed back into the church several months later when the bishop was on his deathbed and felt very guilty, or was encouraged to feel guilty by some of his advisors, is how I've heard the story. And so the Josephites continue to be very much out in the communities where they feel they're needed. St. Mary MacKillop said that you should never see a need without doing something about it. And they still run schools and a lot of aged care facilities. So for a long time, all the sisters were pretty much teachers or nurses. But now one of the reasons I was interested is that the demographics are changing. The average age for a Catholic sister in Australia is about 73 now. So the work they can do is changing as the congregation becomes sort of top heavy, as they put it. They're sort of aging out and becoming more pastoral care, things like that. But also their process for deciding where they work has changed. It used to be that the congregation just sent you where you were needed. And the sister I lived with said that I think that was probably a hard time for some of the artists and contemplatives who are like, no, we need nurses, we need teachers, off you go. And now it's much more of a conversation with an individual sister finding what they're passionate about and where they feel they can thrive and what's a good situation. Because if you're happier, you're probably going to be a better person for everyone around you, which that works because they're in so many different places around Australia, as well as in other countries in New Zealand and East Timor, in Ireland, in Peru. But it also made me think of the Buddhist monastic communities I've seen when people don't have the chance to sort of see different communities and understand that communities are structured very differently and have different emphases. So it's easier for everyone if someone picks a community that aligns with their leanings, but then at the same time, there's never going to be the right place where everything will be easy and perfect and just the way you want it. So it's always a balance. And so with the Sisters of St. Joseph, I was out in a town called Halls Creek, which, if you know where Darwin is at the top of Australia, it's about an 18-hour bus ride south in Western Australia, where I was staying with one of the sisters who's been working with the Aboriginal communities there for about the past 25 years. And when I first got there, I wasn't sure how she could sort of handle the amount of need she's faced with every day, because it's just been so many generations of trauma and really deep suffering and policies that continue to allow Indigenous communities to suffer and don't give the conditions that would allow them to thrive. And Sister Alma, it's really just about, sort of does her best for people right in front of her every day. And her meditation practice is really important. And she's about as attuned to nature as anyone I know. She would notice if different birds came to the bird bath at breakfast, or like when there were ants in the pantry. That wasn't this like frustration, it was this like hopeful thing. It was something to look at that reaffirms your faith of, wow, look how much can be accomplished by a community doing such small pieces of work. So she was a really wonderful resource, I think, because it was probably the most emotionally difficult stay of my year, but also the place that was hardest to leave, and probably the place I think about going back to most. My role was at the local school, mostly in the first grade classroom. And as I've also heard from a Zen priest, kids can teach you a lot about and help you work on your self-grasping, and can teach you a lot about impermanence. It was wonderful to be around them and just be trying to be as supportive and patient and loving as I could be. Now that I've left, it's also somewhere I think a lot about ways I may have been unskillful, ways I may have done harm, whether if just in my way of being, am I imposing some of the systems of power that have done so much harm to Indigenous communities, or if I was only going to be there for 5 weeks, should I have been there in the school at all? So things worth thinking about, and then being back in the States, thinking about the ways that we perpetuate conditions that do so much harm to Indigenous communities. So lots to think about, but really just a wonderful order to spend time with. Not at all what I was expecting from Catholic sisters, I think. They're a very progressive order, have always encouraged expressions of local language and culture in liturgies and Mass. If we would go out to a remote community for Mass, it would be, a lot of it was sung sort of half in English and half in the local language. If you have any questions, that's sort of my summary of my time in Halls Creek. So that's something I think important to me about the Josephites specifically. It was sort of in the past, it was a lot of church groups that were part of some really awful things happening in the stolen generations and taking Aboriginal children away. But in a lot of these communities, one of the places I stayed, Catholicism wasn't brought by white missionaries. It was actually Aboriginal spiritual elders who learned about Catholicism and sort of already had that intertwined with traditional spirituality and brought that to the community. So they were already respected spiritual elders. So that I wasn't as worried about, which was nice. And there are some Aboriginal spiritual leaders who speak really beautifully about when the rains come as like Easter, and some of the bush tuck and the flowers that you eat as like communion. So some really harmonious blending of faiths, but I think I was worried partly about academic systems and sort of ways of learning, and this sort of it's like white Australia mainstream academia, which applies just as much to the US, and because that's a system I've grown up in and been successful in and I'm used to, but that doesn't necessarily fit, or I know that it doesn't fit with Indigenous traditions of learning, and how many of the kids, like it just maybe doesn't suit them that well to be like, okay, I've been talking at you for a while, now go do this worksheet. That's, that just doesn't work that well. And I felt in the classroom, I was there in theory to support the kids who needed extra help, but it just seemed like that was almost all of the kids, almost all the time. And then the kids who didn't need academic support maybe still wanted emotional support, or then where am I making time for the kids at the top of the class who want to talk about how they're picturing gravity, and then the kids, I told them, because I was a geology major, that the moon used to be a piece of the earth that got knocked off, and she came back like 2 weeks later, Miss, when you said that, like, what happened? Was there a 10th planet that used to be in the solar system? And like, so just feeling like resources were spread thin, and for me, like emotionally and in terms of my time, that I didn't have enough.
Gaela, you mentioned that this was the toughest assignment emotionally for you, or the toughest place, and I just wanted to know if you would share a little bit about why that was.
Um, the situation in these communities is really, really difficult, and people, whether it's adults or children, they die of things that are completely preventable. That there's no reason that in a country as wealthy and well resourced as Australia or as the US, that shouldn't happen.